And now, another dramatic episode of As the Page Turns. Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and before I get into this episode, I want to just remind everyone that I'm currently running a giveaway to celebrate the impending arrival of my 200th subscriber. So I'll have a link to the video above and below, and so if you're interested, I'm giving away a couple different things. One's a mystery box, and the other is a CGC issue of Wonder Woman. So if you're interested in both of those, check out the video, and I'll be running those contests until I hit 200 subscribers, and then at that point I'll be doing the giveaway. At this point I'm at 182, so you still have some time. And I'm also, for my 200th subscriber, when I hit there, I'll be doing an Ask Me Anything, and I still need your questions. So any questions you have about anything at all, it doesn't have to be comics related, anything you want, I will answer the question for you. So feel free to leave your questions either on that other announcement video or here. Either's fine. So I just wanted to give that quick reminder, and now let's talk about what we're going to do today. In this episode, I'm going to be starting a new series, As the Page Turns, as I take a close look at some of the ongoing soap opera serialized romance stories in comics. Now, I've mentioned this before. When I was a kid growing up, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. She took care of me like after school and stuff because my parents were working, and she loved her soap operas. So every day we'd watch this certain progression of soap operas over the course of the day, General Hospital, of course, being the best of them. And because of that, like, I have this appreciation for soap operas, and it's sort of my favorite thing in romance comics is when there is an ongoing serialized soap opera. Now, for the most part, most romance comics over the history of the genre, they've been anthologies. They've been sort of one and done shorter stories without any kind of continuity or long form storytelling, because, you know, at the end they always fall in love at the end, right? But there have been, mostly at DC over the years, there were a few ongoing soap operas, and I'm trying to collect all of them. I don't have most of them yet. I have probably half of each of the soap operas, but as I finish putting the runs together, I'm going to be going through them here in this new series, As the Page Turns. So most of DC's soap operas, they're pretty much all take place in the 1960s. And we had, in Young Romance, there was Bonnie Taylor, the airline stewardess. Young Love had two different soap opera serials. The first was Mary Robin, Registered Nurse. The second was The Life and Loves of Lisa St. Clair. Over in Girls' Love Stories, there was an ongoing soap opera for a while called April O'Day. She was a Hollywood starlet, trying to make her way in the movie business and having romantic misadventures in Hollywood. Probably the two that were the most pure soap opera were both written by Barbara Friedlander, and that was Three Girls, Their Lives, Their Loves, and Reach for Happiness. There was also, in Secret Hearts, for a very brief period of time, there was an ongoing one called Amy Ames, who was like a love counselor, and I think I'm blanking on one. I think there was one more. But you get the idea. So those are the main ones. And again, I'm putting all of the runs together. I don't have them all yet put together. But there were a couple runs outside of DC as well. Marvel had Night Nurse, which to me is much more of a pure soap opera than a romance. It's actually borderline to even call it a romance series, because the sort of dramatic and action elements were so pronounced compared to the others. But Charlton also had one as well, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's probably my favorite of the soap operas, definitely my favorite Charlton series, It is Just Married, numbers 93 to 101, featuring the story of David and Eileen. So this comes from 1972, and here's the first issue. There's the cover, and you can see right off the bat, this is sort of groundbreaking material for comics. It was actually edgy even for TV at the time. And it says here, should a Jewish boy and an Irish girl fall in love? Beginning in this issue, the continuing story of David and Eileen, heartache ahead. Now, so this is about sort of an interracial couple, but what it's really about is an interfaith couple. On all of these covers throughout the series, they call him Jewish, but they call her Irish. But what, of course, she really is Irish Catholic. That's where the drama comes into play, and it's explicit in the story. They just tone it down for the covers because I guess that's still a little too edgy for marketing purposes for the period. But what this is a look at an interfaith marriage between a Catholic girl and an Irish guy in the early 1970s, and how the families fight amongst each other, and they're both sort of prejudiced against the other people of the other faith. And so there's all these fireworks as the couple is trying to make their way in the world when the world doesn't seem to want them to actually succeed. And so this is, in this first issue, they basically decide to get married, and both of the families are vehemently against it. And so this just goes through all the reasons why they shouldn't get married, and at the end they decide to anyway, and the families at the end are sort of on board. Here's issue 94. My copy has a piece out of the front cover, and it says, his parents want a Jewish wedding. Her Irish family is against it, but love finds a way. And this one's called Too Many In-Laws. And so in this one, they go to have the wedding, but the bride's family insists on it being a Catholic wedding, and the groom's family insists on it being a traditional Jewish wedding in a synagogue, and the families fight back and forth, and what ends up happening is they have two weddings, one in each. I really appreciate this. Now, of course, I mean, it's a Charlton romance comic, so the message, of course, is often kind of heavy-handed, and some of the gender politics that are in the book, we'll see a little bit later on, are still just as backwards as, you know, any other romance comic from 72, which is when they may have been at their most backwards in a weird way. But they're trying to do something really interesting and sort of groundbreaking, really pushing the envelope in a way that only Charlton could do. DC's not going to even try this. Like, they are not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. But Charlton has a lot more leeway. The creators there have a lot more leeway, and the editors don't really care if they even have editors on some of these books. So Charlton's able to try things that the other publishers can't do. So here's 95. My copy's in wonderful condition, except Pop Staple. I've noticed for some reason this issue has a lot of really nice copies around. It's one of the few white covers that I have from Charlton in particular that's actually white, because their page quality is so crappy, but it does have the Pop Staple. And this says, she wants to go to the Catskills. He wants to go to Maine. Will their marriage survive their first spat? Now, you may or may not pick up on the fact that these are backwards. This is sort of a gift of the Magi sort of thing. Being from a Jewish family, his family traditionally vacations in the Catskills, because that's sort of a cliche, particularly at that time. Whereas her family has traditionally gone to Maine for vacation. And what happens is each of them insists that they go to their partner's family's traditional vacation for their honeymoon. He's like, we should go to Maine because that's where you guys always go. And she's like, no, we should go to the Catskills. And so the families end up, again, the families are always fighting each other with the couple caught in the middle, which I think it's a very real thing that happens in a lot of marriages. And to have it play out in a romance comic, I think is really interesting. What ends up happening is, at the end, they compromise by not going to either place. And in the next issue, we get their honeymoon. Here it is, issue 96, where they end up going to Hawaii instead. And the blurb says, even in a tropical paradise, their different backgrounds of Jewish and Irish threaten their marriage. Happiness is a honeymoon in Hawaii. So yeah, they go on the honeymoon here. This copy happens to be as close as I've gotten to my birthday. I'm trying to find a date stamp from the day I was born, but the problem is there weren't any comics released on the day I was born. There were comics released the day before and the day after. This has a date stamp from the day after I was born, and I actually, when I got this copy, I already had a different copy in '96, and I got rid of it when I got this one because I love the date stamps. But in the same pile of comics, there were 2 other Charlton romance with the same date stamp. So obviously they all came from the same collection, and the same person went to the newsstand the day these came out and just bought all the Charlton books. Here they are. It looks like they're still on vacation, although I don't think they are. Ruthie was beautiful and still in love with David. Eileen knew she was his kind of woman. So here we have one of David's ex-girlfriends shows up, and David and Eileen are just married, and so now there's jealousy as she deals with the ex. What I find really interesting about this series, Just Married is my favorite of the Charlton romance books, and a big part of it has to do with this serial, but also I find just the premise of Just Married to be really fascinating, because the whole point of romance comics in general, like typically as a genre, right? It's a fantasy for the young girls and the boys that are reading it, about falling in love. That's the fantasy, but not in Just Married, because Just Married takes place after that. Just Married is what happens after people fall in love and they get married, because all of the stories in Just Married are about newly married couples, right? And this series ran for like 114 issues or something. And so it's really interesting that a series that's explicitly about the difficulties you face as newlyweds would be so popular that it could run for like 15 years. So I find it really interesting in general, but I just love this storyline in particular. When their money mysteriously disappeared, so did Eileen's trust. Love is trusting. It's Just Married number 98. Again, I got a nice date stamp on this one. It's August 8, 1973. From the same collection. And this is a really interesting story because it deals with sort of the financial stresses that come into play in a marriage. And now there's some early 70s sort of gender things going on here, where he has a job, is making all this money, and he handles the finances, and he doesn't tell her anything that's going on. She basically finds out that there's like $1,000 missing, and so she doesn't know what's going on because he doesn't include her in any of the decision making, and misunderstandings happen. It turns out that he's been like floating this money to someone at work who needs it for something or whatever, and it's all fine at the end. But again, it's really interesting. You've got this romance series, and what's dealing with very real marriage issues in a way that seems kind of strange for a comic book to be doing. Again, it's kind of heavy-handed and unsubtle in a lot of ways, but just the fact that they're doing it is really interesting. Issue 99, a cover that I absolutely love because it's Charlton being sexy. I've mentioned this before, where there's very, very well drawn, attractive characters on Marvel and DC books and some of the other publishers, but they're not overtly sexy usually. There's the comics code getting in the way. Charlton's pushing the envelope in ways in a lot of their covers that Marvel and DC are not doing. And this is one I love, where the couple's in bed together and they're sharing a single pair of pajamas. She's wearing the top but no bottom, and he's wearing the bottom but doesn't have the top on, of course, because she's wearing it. This is a couple that's clearly getting it on. Like, they're newlyweds, they're in bed together, they're basically naked except for one pair of pajamas that they're sharing between the two of them. This is highly suggestive, and I just love this cover. The covers and the art, they're all done by a guy named Martinez, and these are like South American or Filipino artists. I forget. They didn't really do. The inker is by Zuniga, but it's not Tony Zuniga. It's Jay. I think it's Jose. It's an art team that I haven't seen outside of these, and that's the case for a lot of these. But of course, in the early '70s, there was a big push with all the publishers bringing in Filipino artists and South American artists, and Charlton was no different. And they do really good work throughout this, in the sort of style you would expect. 100. David thought Chuck and Dinah were snubbing them because he was Jewish. But Irish Eileen pointed out that they didn't talk to her either. Then they became friends and wound up with tears and heartbreak. It's Just Married number 100. Mine actually, the sticker's not on the bag. It's actually on the cover. It's from some grocery store from the 70s. This is the last of their cover appearances, Just Married number 100, and it has to do with there's another newlywed couple, and then they get a little too close. And then finally, last issue, 101, is the only one of their series that David and Eileen are not on the cover. It's got this great classic bikini cover by Art Capello. I've showed this off before. But this inside, there's a David and Eileen story. It's the last of them, and at the end, they're like, "Let us know if you want to see more of David and Eileen." And apparently, people didn't. The series was canceled just like a couple years later. Now, David and Eileen did make one last appearance in the early '80s. Charlton decided, as they did occasionally during the '80s, to start up production again because they had shut down a couple times, and they put out a bunch of reprint books, and that only lasted a couple months, and then they shut down again. One of them was called Soap Opera Love. They put out 2 soap opera series in the early '80s. The other one's called Soap Opera Romances. And Soap Opera Love was reprinting the David and Eileen story, so I think they only got through like 3 issues before it was canceled. Soap Opera Romances, they were reprinting one of their nurse stories. So at some point in the distant future, I might also include some of those nursing serials in this, but I don't actually have any of those yet. So I'll probably do all of the mainstream DC and Marvel romance soap operas first. But just to mention, in the early 60s, there was a fad on television of shows about doctors and shows about nurses, and so as a result, there was a fad in comics around 60, 61 with a bunch of comics that are about either doctors or nurses, and so there were several series with nurses from that time period that are sort of, they're medical dramas with romance mixed in. So Charlton's was called Cynthia Doyle, registered nurse or something like that. Dell actually had a series called Linda Lark, who was a registered nurse, and there's 3 or 4 others. So those are all ones that are on my radar, but they're a little bit outside of the pure romance genre, so I haven't started getting them. But anyway, I just wanted to show off David and Eileen, Just Married number 93 to 101, and a great 9-issue run that really pushes the boundaries and tries to do a lot of interesting things that you're just not going to see in other romance comics, and they don't always do it well, but they're trying things you're just not going to see anywhere else in comics, which is why I love this run so much. So there you have it for As the Page Turns. Next time around, next time I do another one of these, it'll probably be Night Nurse, because I do have a full run of those 4 issues, and I love that series. But that'll be a little ways down the road. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.